Good evening, everyone. Today is the last day of our presentation, and I am going to present fantasy and religion in 20th century. Fantasy in literature. Elements of supernatural and fantastic world were an element of literature from its beginning. Through the idea of distinct genre in the modern sense is less than 2 centuries old. Historically, most works of fantasy were written. However, since the 1960s, is a growing segment of the fantasy genre has taken from in the form of films, television programs, graphic novels, video games, music, and art. Stories involving magic and terrible monsters have existed in spoken forms before the advent of printed literature. Classical mythology is repeated with fantastical stories and characters, the best known and perhaps the most relevant to modern fantasy being the works of Homer and Virgil. So, the we can say the rise of fantasy literature was from 1960s, and before that there were J.K. Rowling's books were fantasy books were published in 1937 and 1915. The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings came, but in 1916s, Stanley, very famous comic writer, came, and he created the most fantastic stories, and by the time he developed those stories to movies and programs, books, and much more. And also I want to say that there is a fantasy literature in Indian stories too, right from the ancient time. And we find that Panchatantra, the tales of animals, are the most famous and old version of fantasy literature. Also, Vikram Betal and Vedas written by Ved Vyas has stories which fantasize us. Fantasy in 20th century literature. An important factor in development of the fantasy genre was the arrival of magazines devoted to fantasy fiction. In first genre was written in books which don't gives us that much interest, because most of people's don't read that much. But by the time the movies and stories came into video graphics, so that was the rise of fantasy literature. There was a publication of German magazine, and which ran from 1990 to 1921. In 1923, the first English language fantasy fiction magazine came. Weird Tales was created. Many other similar magazines eventually followed the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. The pulp magazine format was the height of its popularity at this time and was instrumental in beginning fantasy fiction to a wide audience in the US. Best contribution towards fantasy is, as one of our presentation we saw that the Hobbits, the Lord of the Rings were good contribution towards this fantasy literature. But also the Harry Potter by Rowling is also a good contribution. Now, Stanley is a comic writer. So of course we all know that the greatest Marvel series, the superhero series, which has Spider Man, Batman, X Men, Iron Man, Thor, and many more, which connects us with a memory that what will be the next. So. These are the characters pioneered by Stanley and other his co-writers, and in the 1960s, this was a very less following. It was started from, I think, the first movie. I believe that first movie was the the Fantastic Four was the first movie, and by the time the series followed by the Fantastic Fours, the X-Men series, the Captain America, Doctor Strange movies, Spider-Man's, and so many there. Marvel Stories was started in 1939 by Martin Goodman as Timely Comics. By 1951, he generally became known as Atlas Comics. The Marvel era began in 1961, the year that the company launched the Fantastic Four and other superhero titles created by Stan Lee, Jack, Steve, and many others writers. The Marvel brand, which had been used over the years, was solidified as the company's primary brand. And I have took a movie from Marvels, and that is the series of X Men. And from that series, I have took a movie X Men Apocalypse, which was released in 2016. And what is the background of that movie? In Marvel's universe, mutants are humans who are born with a genetic trait called the X gene, which grants them natural superhuman abilities. Due to their differences from the majority of humanity, mutants are subject to prejudice and discrimination. That many X-Men stories feature social commentary on bigotry and justice. The X-Men have fought against a variety of enemies, including villainous mutants, human bigots, mystical threats, and malevolent artificial intelligences. In most interactions of the team, they are led by their founder Charles, Professor X, Professor Charles, a powerful telepath who runs a school for mutant children out of his mansion. There are students who live in his own mansion. Uh, their stories have frequently involved a Magneto, a powerful mutant with a control over magnetic fields, who is depicted as an old friend of Xavier. As it goes about setting current and Egypt, a future X-Men up to battle against Apocalypse, who has risen from 4th century into 1983. So the movie starts. This is the two pictures. The opening scenes where there is a man in Egypt. In Egypt, this man is. There are several people who are doing and in a process to create an villainous mutant who can destroy everything. And if you go and watch that movie, you saw that you find that they are s- they are many they are so many that they are so strong that they can destroy everything. Like if you are standing, they can turn you into the walls and water and many things. So the idea of the movie is there is a action, science fiction, fantasy. Also, there are few comic scenes, but it is all about how to save world. And one of our villainous mutant belongs to the Egyptian group, which is very much there is less literature from Egypt, and we found that the combination of science fiction and fantasy in the very opening scene. So this is one of the movie based on fantasies. Also, immortal powers are there, uh, and there are character like Kurtz and Scots who creates funny scenes in between. And there is a I think in a fantasy there is a less connection with God, and this is the comparison of movie genre in India. We mostly don't see that much of fantasy science fiction in compared to US and Canada. So we are 79% we are following comedy and less action, less thriller. And in US there is a uh, first the first row shown is about fantasy, then action, then drama. So we can compare that India is very slow in coming in the line, that we are very in very small thinking, like people are following just comedy rather than following thrillers and science fiction. These are my citations.
Who is asking? Nidhi.
So my question is, why is fantasy important in literature?
There is so many genre in literature like comedy. There are several comedies, dramas, history, but we have we have just 2 century of history of fantasy. So by the time we have to turn to fantasy, like watching those kind of movie. Also, there is fantasy in ancient time in Homer's Iliad or the Trojan War, the Agamemnon. That was fantasy is much more giving us kind of a thing to watch as a excitement, as a suspense that what is going to happen. Like in all the Marvel movies, so you find that whenever any movie ends, it gives the uh, little little much trailer of each movies in previous movies. So fantasy is important.
Okay, so Vaishalana, my question to you is that what, according to you, could be the drawbacks of fantastical elements and their involvement in the movie? So, do you find any drawbacks that these kind of elements are involved in these movies, on the society or in the movie as well? Thank you.
No, actually, fantasy is what? Fantasy is there are every there are so many literature in fantasy also, right? So uh, those are in Panchatantra. We find that that animal stories gives us that idea to how everyone sees that Panchatantra stories, right? So from our childhood we learn something from that Panchatantra. So that is that fantasy elements are connected into society also.